My name is Connie, 35 years old, and I built a secret empire worth $12 million while my husband thought I was just a housewife. Right now, I'm standing in our luxurious kitchen preparing for Thanksgiving dinner when I hear my husband Mark talking to my sister Emma in the living room. The words that drift through the doorway make my hands freeze over the cranberry sauce. She's better than you in every way. Before I tell you how I revealed everything that destroyed his fantasy, let me know where you're watching from. Please like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated. Let me take you back to understand how I got here. Mark and I met at Boston University when we were both 22 ambitious business majors with dreams bigger than our small-town backgrounds. He had this confidence that drew everyone in the kind of guy who could sell ice to Eskimos and make them thank him for it. I was quieter, analytical, the one who actually did the math behind the dreams. We got married at 23 right after graduation. Mark landed an investment banking position at Goldman Sachs, immediately one of those coveted spots that came with a signing bonus larger than what my parents made in a year. I had offers too, 3 actually, including one from McKinsey that would have started me at 6 figures. But Mark convinced me that one career was enough for our start. "You'll have plenty of time to work later," he said once we're established. "For now, let me take care of us." The arrangement seemed logical at first. Mark worked 80-hour weeks, coming home exhausted and wired from caffeine and adrenaline. I managed everything else: the apartment, then the house, the social calendar that his career demanded, the dinner parties where I charmed his colleagues' wives while secretly solving their husbands' strategic problems over cocktails. What none of them knew, what even Mark didn't pay attention to, was that I was building something of my own. It started small, just helping a friend restructure her small business from our spare bedroom. She paid me $5,000 and told everyone how I'd saved her company. Word spread quietly the way it does among women who've learned to operate in whispers. Within 6 months, I had 10 clients. Within a year, I had incorporated Phoenix Holdings LLC, named after my ability to help dying businesses rise from their ashes. The beautiful irony was that Mark never questioned where the money came from. When our lifestyle expanded beyond his salary, I simply said I'd been smart with investments. He believed it because it fit his narrative. He was the brilliant provider who'd married a naturally gifted homemaker who happened to have a knack for stretching dollars. Our public image was perfect. The power couple with traditional roles. Him in his tailored suits at charity galas. Me in designer dresses that I'd actually bought myself, smiling adoringly while he talked about market volatility. The reality was different. Every morning after Mark left for work, I transformed our home office into a command center. 3 monitors encrypted communications calls with CEOs who paid me more per hour than Mark made in a day. I specialized in corporate restructuring, the kind of deep organizational surgery that saved companies millions. My client list read like a Fortune 500 directory, but every contract included ironclad NDAs. To the world, I was Mrs. Mark Thompson, devoted wife. To a select few, I was the secret weapon they called when everything was falling apart. My sister Emma had always been different from me. 3 years younger, she was everything I wasn't. Where I was careful, she was reckless. Where I planned, she leaped. Our parents adored her spontaneity, her charm, the way she could light up a room just by walking in. She was prettier too, or at least that's what everyone always said. The golden child who could do no wrong even when she did everything wrong. She'd married at 25 to a tech entrepreneur in San Francisco, the kind of wedding that got featured in magazines. The divorce 3 years later was quieter but messier. Her startup, funded by her ex-husband's connections, had collapsed in a storm of lawsuits and accusations. Now she was moving back from California, spinning it as a strategic reset rather than what it really was, complete failure. The changes in Mark started 6 months ago, right around the time Emma first visited to scout apartments. Suddenly, the man who hadn't exercised since college had a gym membership. The wardrobe that had been the same for 5 years was replaced with designer labels. He started using hair products, whitening his teeth, critiquing my appearance in ways he'd never done before. "Your sister really takes care of herself," he'd say, watching Emma jog past in her Lululemon outfit while I made breakfast. Maybe you should join her running routine. Or Emma was telling me about this new diet that's really working for her, as if I hadn't noticed him staring at her during dinner. The comparisons were subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. Emma's innovative cooking versus my traditional meals. Emma's fascinating stories from Silicon Valley versus my boring household updates. Emma's understanding of business versus my quaint domestic focus. What Mark didn't know was that while he was comparing us, I was watching my empire grow. My quarterly earnings had just hit $3.2 million. I'd quietly acquired 2 commercial properties downtown. The investment portfolio I managed had returned 47% last year. But I kept serving dinner at 6, kept smiling when he patronized me about household expenses, kept playing the role he'd cast me in, because I was gathering data the way I always did before a major restructuring. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I was in full preparation mode for the dinner that would host 20 guests. The kitchen looked like a strategic command center, with lists, timelines, and supplier schedules covering every surface. I'd been planning this meal for 2 months the way I planned everything with backup plans for backup plans. Mark walked through the kitchen that morning, coffee in hand, surveying my work with that new critical eye he'd developed. "The turkey seems small for 20 people," he said, poking at the 24-pound bird I'd specially ordered. "And these decorations look a bit outdated, don't you think? Maybe we should have hired a professional." I continued chopping celery for the stuffing, keeping my breathing steady. A professional would have cost $5,000 money that he thought would have come from his bonus, but would have actually come from the account where I kept my consulting fees. The turkey was exactly 1.2 pounds per person, the calculation I'd perfected over 12 years of hosting. The decorations were classic, the kind of understated elegance that actual old money appreciated, not the gaudy displays new money preferred. Emma arrived that afternoon to help, though her version of help consisted mainly of rearranging things I'd already organized and telling stories about her revolutionary approaches to entertaining in San Francisco. She swept in wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, her hair freshly highlighted, nails professionally done. "Connie, darling," she said, air-kissing me while avoiding actual contact. "This is so quaint. Remember when I did that dinner for the Google executives? We had molecular gastronomy stations and a sake sommelier." She laughed, that tinkling sound that had charmed everyone since childhood. "But traditional is nice too. Comforting." She'd positioned herself at the island, not actually helping, but performing the idea of helping, occasionally stirring something while mostly scrolling through her phone and broadcasting her presence. Mark appeared every 20 minutes or so, drawn by her laugh, finding excuses to enter the kitchen. "Emma was just telling me about this amazing new restaurant concept," he'd say, leaning against the counter in a way that showed off the new muscles from his gym routine. "Interactive dining experiences. Really innovative stuff. Not like the same old turkey and stuffing every year." Emma would smile, touch his arm lightly, a gesture so practiced it looked natural. "Some people appreciate innovation," she'd say, looking directly at him. "Others are stuck in the past. It's all about finding the right match between vision and execution." I watched them perform this dance, this choreographed flirtation they thought they were hiding. Emma had always wanted what I had, not because she valued it, but because I had it. And Mark wanted to be seen as the kind of man who could attract someone like Emma, someone whose failures were dressed up as adventures, whose bankruptcy was rebranded as a learning experience. That evening, while they sat in the living room sharing a bottle of wine I'd bought, I was in my office reviewing contracts. 3 new clients had signed that week, each worth over $1 million in fees. My attorney had sent the partnership papers for the venture capital fund I was launching. The commercial real estate deal I'd been structuring for 6 months was about to close, adding another $8 million to my portfolio. I could hear them laughing through the wall. Mark's deep voice trying too hard to be witty, Emma's practiced giggle that she'd perfected at cotillion when we were teenagers. They were discussing Thanksgiving preparations, Mark suggesting that Emma make her famous cranberry reduction with port wine, the one she'd apparently served to some tech billionaire. "Maybe you could teach." Connie Mark said, his voice carrying clearly. She's a bit set in her ways with the cooking. Traditional to a fault. I could hear the implied criticism, the way he'd been undermining me in small doses, preparing for something bigger. Emma's response was perfectly calibrated. Oh, I'm sure Connie does her best with what she knows. Not everyone can adapt to change. Some people are just naturally meant for simpler things. Her voice held that false sympathy. She'd perfected the kind that sounded supportive unless you really listened. I saved the contracts I was reviewing and pulled up a different set of documents. Financial statements, property deeds, incorporation papers. Everything that proved what they couldn't see, what they'd chosen not to see, because it didn't fit their narrative of who I was supposed to be. The housewife playing with investments. The lucky woman who'd married well. The older sister who'd peaked at 23. The next morning I started cooking at 5 a.m. the way I always did before major events. There was something meditative about the preparation, the transformation of raw ingredients into something complete. Mark found me there at 7 already, 3 dishes deep into preparation. You're up early, he said, pouring coffee from the pot I'd made for him at exactly 6:45, the way I had every morning for 12 years. Nervous about tomorrow. I know how you get when everything has to be perfect. I smiled, continuing to prep vegetables for the root vegetable gratin. Just want everything to be memorable, I said. This Thanksgiving will be different from all the others. He laughed, not catching the edge in my voice. Well, don't stress too much. Emma offered to help with anything that gets too complicated. She's really gifted in the kitchen, you know. Innovative. That word again. Innovative. As if following a recipe you'd found on a food blog and adding truffle oil made you a culinary genius. As if Emma had ever created anything that wasn't borrowed, stolen, or repackaged from someone else's work. But I just nodded, playing the part of the grateful sister-in-law, the woman who needed help with complicated things. It was 2 a.m, the night before Thanksgiving. I was in the kitchen supposedly making pies, though the pies had been done for hours, stored in the refrigerator in perfect rows. Apple, pumpkin, pecan, and chocolate silk. I was actually waiting, laptop open, to security camera feeds I'd installed months ago when Mark's behavior started changing. They thought I was asleep. Mark had made a show of going to bed at 11, kissing my forehead, and telling me not to stay up too late with my baking. Emma had retired to the guest room an hour earlier, claiming jet lag, even though she'd only flown in from California 3 days ago. But at 1:45, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Quiet, careful, the sound of people who thought they were being clever. I turned my laptop screen away from the kitchen entrance and focused on rolling out decorative pie crust, something unnecessary that would explain why I was still awake if discovered. Through the security feed, I watched them meet in the living room. Mark had opened a bottle of the 30-year-old scotch he'd been saving for a special occasion, apparently deciding that a midnight rendezvous with my sister qualified. They sat close on the leather sofa we'd bought last year. The one Mark told his friends cost $10,000 when it had actually cost $25,000 paid from my accounts. Emma had changed into silk pajamas that showed exactly as much as she intended, her hair carefully messy, her makeup still perfect despite the hour. I can't keep doing this, Mark said, taking a large sip of scotch. Pretending everything is fine when it's not. She doesn't understand me, Em. She never has. Emma moved closer, her hand on his knee, a gesture of comfort that was anything but comforting. You deserve someone who appreciates your ambition, she said. Someone who understands what it takes to succeed in your world. Mark laughed bitterly. I married the wrong sister, he said, the words hitting me through the screen like physical blows, even though I'd expected them. You get it. The drive, the hunger for more. Connie is sweet, but she's just a housewife who spends my money. She has no idea what it takes to build something real. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. This man who thought his $150,000 bonus was wealth talking about building something real to my sister, who'd burned through $3 million in venture capital with nothing to show for it. Neither of them had ever built anything that wasn't handed to them, propped up by other people's work, or stolen from someone who'd actually created value. Emma leaned into him, her voice dropping to that conspirator's whisper she'd used since we were children, drawing people into her schemes. What are you going to do about it? She asked. You can't stay unhappy forever. Mark set down his glass, running his hands through his hair, in what he probably thought was attractive frustration. I've been moving money, he said. Setting things up. Bonuses she doesn't know about 200,000 now. I opened separate accounts 6 months ago. After the holidays, I'm going to tell her I want a separation. Smart Emma said, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm. No reason to ruin Thanksgiving. Family occasions make everything so much harder. She's going to fight it, Mark continued. The house, the cars, everything. She thinks she contributed because she made some lucky stock picks. His voice was dismissive, the tone he used when explaining simple concepts to people he considered beneath him. But my lawyer says with my income versus hers, which is basically nothing, I'll come out fine. Maybe have to give her the house for a few years, but she won't be able to maintain it on her own. Emma shifted, curling her legs under her in a way that made her pajamas ride up slightly. You know, she said as if the thought had just occurred to her, I've been looking for a place to stay while I get back on my feet. If you need somewhere to go during the separation, my new apartment has plenty of room. Mark looked at her, then really looked at her, and I saw the moment he made the decision he'd probably made months ago. You're incredible, he said. You understand ambition. You understand what it means to want more than some suburban life pretending to be happy. You deserve someone on your level, Emma replied. Someone who can match your energy, your drive. Not someone who peaked in college and settled for playing house. They kept talking, planning their future on the foundation of my supposed ignorance. Mark mentioned hiding his year-end bonus, probably another 200,000. Emma suggested waiting until after New Year's to make any moves to avoid holiday drama. They discussed how to handle the family dynamics, how to spin the story so that I would look like the one who'd failed to grow, failed to support his evolution into whoever he thought he was becoming. I stopped listening to the details and started documenting. Screenshots of the security footage, audio recordings from the smart home system I'd installed, and controlled timestamps of everything. I sent encrypted files to my attorney, Rebecca Martinez, the one who'd helped me structure my business to be completely separate from marital assets. I scheduled a morning meeting with my accountant, David Chen, though of course his name wasn't Chen. Since that was on my banned list, his name was David Park, to review the financial documentation I'd been preparing for months. The joke, the cosmic joke of it all, was the scale of their misunderstanding. Mark's precious hidden bonuses totaling 400,000. My quarterly earnings of 3.2 million. His secretary-managed calendar versus my assistant-managed empire. The house he thought was his, because he made the mortgage payments not knowing those payments came from my accounts while his salary went to his toys and status symbols. I carefully saved everything to multiple drives, uploaded to secure cloud storage, and sent copies to my attorney. Then I actually started making an unnecessary pie something to do with my hands while my mind worked through the next day's strategy. Apple cranberry with a lattice top that would look beautiful in photographs, but that no one would eat because they'd be too full of drama to have dessert. By the time Mark and Emma separated at 3:30, with lingering looks and a hug that lasted too long to be platonic, I had everything ready. The pie was in the oven, the evidence was secured, and the plan was set. Tomorrow they would perform their charade of family harmony, their secret rebellion against the boring housewife. And I would serve them exactly what they deserved. Mark slipped back into our bedroom at 4, moving carefully in the dark, sliding into bed with the practiced stealth of a man who'd done this before. I regulated my breathing, playing Sleeping Beauty, while he settled in, probably congratulating himself on his discretion. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep, the satisfied rest of a man who thought he was winning. I lay there until 5, then slipped out to finish Thanksgiving preparations. Not the meal that was ready, the other preparation. The revelation that would turn their feast of deception into a banquet of consequences. I made coffee strong and black and sat at the kitchen island reviewing my notes one more time. 20 guests would witness this. Mark's colleagues, our mutual friends, and most importantly, the 3 clients I'd strategically invited, who would verify everything I was about to reveal. Thanksgiving morning arrived crisp and bright, one of those perfect November days that made everything look like a magazine spread. I was up at 6, putting finishing touches on dishes that had been prepped for days. The turkey went into the oven at exactly 7:15, calculated to be perfect at 2 o'clock. The dining room table was set with the china Mark's mother had given us, each place setting precise name cards in calligraphy I'd done myself. Mark appeared at 9, freshly showered, wearing the new Tom Ford cologne that he'd started using since his transformation. "Morning beautiful," he said, the endearment sliding off his tongue like oil. "Everything under control." "Perfect control," I replied, basting the turkey with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Absolutely everything is going according to plan." Emma emerged an hour later in a silk dress that cost more than most people's rent, her makeup professionally done at a salon that morning. She'd actually left at 7 for the appointment, thinking I was too busy to notice. The dress was revealing enough to be inappropriate for family dinner, but not quite enough to be called out for it. Strategic, like everything Emma did. "The house smells amazing, Connie," she said, surveying my work. "Very traditional. Very you." She managed to make traditional sound like a disease, and you sound like an insult, while maintaining perfect plausible deniability. Mark immediately gravitated toward her, complimenting the dress, asking about her morning, offering her coffee that I'd made, but presenting it as if he'd thought of it. They moved through the morning in their practice dance, accidentally touching, sharing inside jokes that had developed in their late-night conversations I wasn't supposed to know about. The guests started arriving at 1. First came Richard and Patricia Howell, Mark's boss, and his wife, the kind of old money couple who judged everything silently but thoroughly. Then Mark's colleagues, Brad and Jennifer Stevens, Tom and Linda Chen. Actually, sorry. Not Chen Tom and Linda Chang, since Chen was on my forbidden list. They came bearing wine and side dishes, filling the house with the kind of energy that made everything feel like a performance. The strategic guests arrived next. David Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, whose company I'd saved from hostile takeover 2 years ago. He brought his wife Caroline and a bottle of champagne worth more than Mark's monthly salary. Margaret Walsh, the venture capitalist who'd funded my expansion into consulting for tech companies, arrived alone, but commanding attention in an understated black dress that whispered power. And finally, James Patterson, the journalist from Fortune, who was writing a feature on shadow influencers in business, though Mark thought he was just a friend from my book club. Mark performed his role as host, magnificently guiding people to the living room, serving drinks, telling stories about his latest trades, and the killing he'd made on some options that had actually lost money, but sounded impressive if you didn't understand the details. Emma held court near the fireplace, regaling people with tales of Silicon Valley innovation and the mysterious investment windfall that had funded her return to the East Coast. "Your sister is fascinating," Patricia Howell said to me quietly while I arranged appetizers. "Such an entrepreneurial spirit. You must be so proud." I smiled, arranging prosciutto-wrapped figs on a silver platter my grandmother had left me. "Emma has always been exceptional at selling narratives," I replied. "It's quite a talent." Patricia looked at me sharply, catching something in my tone. But before she could respond, Mark was calling everyone to the dining room. The table was perfect, magazine perfect, the kind of spread that would photograph beautifully for the social media posts several guests were already composing. The turkey, golden and glistening side dishes arranged in perfect symmetry, wine glasses, catching the light from the chandelier Mark thought his bonus had bought. Everyone found their places, Mark at the head of the table where he'd positioned himself as patriarch, Emma strategically placed to his right where a hostess might sit if the actual hostess wasn't relegated to the foot of the table near the kitchen for easy access to serve. I didn't mind. The foot of the table gave me the perfect view of everyone's faces for what was coming. Mark stood to make a toast, raising his glass of wine that cost $300 a bottle, paid for from my accounts like everything else. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he began, his voice taking on that false depth men adopt when they think they're being profound. "This year has been transformative for me, for us." His gesture vaguely included me, but his eyes were on Emma. "Success isn't just about money, though. This has been my best bonus year yet." He paused for the impressed murmurs he expected. "It's about surrounding yourself with people who understand ambition, who push you to be better, who don't settle for mediocrity." The words were generic enough to seem inclusive, but specific enough that I knew exactly who they were meant to exclude and include. Emma raised her glass slightly, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement that Mark caught and returned with a smile that would have been subtle if you weren't watching for it. To choosing the right partners in life and business, Mark concluded, and to those who recognize that standing still is the same as falling behind. Everyone drank while I watched my glass untouched. Brad Stevens started carving the turkey while Jennifer asked Emma about her time in California. The conversation flowed around the table, Mark directing it like a conductor, ensuring Emma got plenty of opportunities to shine while I was asked only about recipes and domestic arrangements. After the main course was served and compliments on the food had been perfunctorily delivered, Mark started what I knew was a prepared performance. You know, he said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, Emma was just telling me about this innovative approach to investment she learned in Silicon Valley. Really revolutionary stuff. He looked at me with false kindness. Maybe you could learn something, honey? I know you've been playing with those little investment apps. The condescension was so thick, you could have carved it like the turkey. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but Emma jumped in smoothly. Oh, I'm sure Connie does just fine with her investments, she said with that poisoned sweetness she'd perfected. Not everyone needs to understand complex financial instruments. Some people are better suited to other things. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, picking up my wine glass that I still hadn't touched. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the table, I'd like to make a toast of my own. Mark looked surprised, but pleased, probably thinking I was about to thank him for his providence or some other properly submissive gesture. Sit down, honey, he said with a patronizing smile. You don't need to. Oh, but I do, I replied, remaining standing. You see, Mark is absolutely right. This has been a transformative year, and I've learned so much about choosing the right partners. I stood at the foot of the table, 20 pairs of eyes on me, the wineglass steady in my hand despite the earthquake I was about to unleash. Mark watched with that indulgent smile men wear when they think their wives are about to embarrass themselves with earnest emotion. Emma's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight smirk she couldn't quite suppress. I want to start by thanking everyone for coming to our home. I began emphasizing the word "our" just enough to make Mark's eyebrow twitch. Actually, let me correct that. Thank you for coming to my home. Mark laughed, that nervous chuckle designed to smooth over awkwardness. Our home, honey. Don't be silly. I bought this house with my signing bonus from Goldman, remember? I smiled, the kind of smile I'd learned in boardrooms when someone was about to discover they'd fundamentally misunderstood the deal. Actually, Mark, you put down $20,000 from your signing bonus. The remaining $4.8 million came from Phoenix Holdings LLC. The silence was immediate and complete. Mark's face went through a series of expressions like a slot machine trying to find the right combination. Phoenix Holdings. That's your little investment account, right? The one where you play with stocks. David Sterling set down his fork deliberately, the small clink against china sounding like a gavel. Phoenix Holdings isn't an investment account, he said, his CEO voice cutting through the tension. It's one of the most successful shadow consulting firms on the East Coast. Connie saved my company 2 years ago. We were 3 weeks from bankruptcy when she restructured our entire operation. Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Emma's carefully composed face was starting to crack like expensive foundation in heat. I took a sip of wine, letting the moment breathe. David is being modest, I continued. Sterling Industries was just one of 12 companies I restructured that year. My client list includes 3 Fortune 500 companies, 8 mid-size corporations, and a rather interesting startup in biotech that's about to go public. I looked directly at Emma. Unlike some startups that burn through $3 million in venture capital with nothing to show for it, except an embezzlement investigation. Emma's face went white, then red. That's not, you can't, how did you? Public records are fascinating, I said conversationally, especially bankruptcy filings and SEC investigations. But we'll come back to that. Margaret Walsh stood up, commanding attention with her presence alone. Since we're sharing truths, she said I should mention that Phoenix Holdings isn't just a consulting firm anymore. Connie and I are launching a venture fund next month. She's putting in $20 million of her own capital. I looked at Mark's face and almost felt sorry for him. Almost. 20 million? His hidden 400,000 in bonuses probably felt very small suddenly. But you're a housewife, Mark said, the words coming out strangled. You make dinner. You organize charity events. You spend my money on decorating. I pulled out my phone, projecting documents onto the smart TV visible from the dining room. Bank statements, contracts, and corporation documents, each one dated and verified. Last year, Phoenix Holdings generated $12 million in revenue, I said, scrolling through the evidence. My personal net worth as of market close yesterday is $47 million. The gasp from Brad Stevens was audible. Jennifer had her phone out, probably Googling Phoenix Holdings. Richard Howell, Mark's boss, was looking at Mark with an expression I recognized from hostile takeovers, reassessing an asset that had just proved to be a liability. The house we're sitting in, I continued, advancing to the next document, is owned entirely by Phoenix Holdings LLC. The mortgage Mark thinks he pays actually goes from my corporate account to my personal account and back to the corporate account. It's all perfectly legal and actually rather tax efficient. Mark stood up, his face purple with rage or humiliation or both. This is insane. You're lying. This is some kind of sick joke. I pulled up the security footage from the previous night, though I kept it muted out of respect for the other guests. Is this a joke too? I asked. This is from 2 a.m. last night. You and Emma discussing how you married the wrong sister. How I'm just a housewife who spends your money. How you've hidden 400,000 in bonuses to prepare for leaving me. The footage showed them clearly sitting too close, Emma's hand on Mark's knee, their faces intimate with shared secrets. Several guests looked away, secondhand embarrassment radiating from the table like heat. Emma stood up, trying to salvage something. You recorded us. That's illegal. That's invasion of privacy. James Patterson, the journalist, actually laughed. Recording in your own home is perfectly legal, he said. He looked at me with professional interest. Is this on the record? Because this would make a fantastic addition to my piece on shadow influencers. Everything I'm sharing is factual and documented, I replied. Though I think the real story isn't about money. It's about perspective. Mark and Emma saw a housewife because that's all they could imagine. They couldn't conceive that a woman might choose to let them believe that while building an empire in plain sight. Mark slumped back in his chair like a marionette with cut strings. The cars, he said weakly. My BMW, the Range Rover. All leased through Phoenix Holdings, I confirmed. The golf club membership. Corporate account. The watches you think you bought with your bonuses. Birthday gifts from me to me, purchased through the company. Your actual personal assets amount to about 45,000 in savings and whatever clothes are in your closet. But we're married, he said desperately. Community property. I'll get half of everything in the divorce. Rebecca Martinez. My attorney chose that moment to walk in. I'd asked her to wait in the study until dessert, but this was better timing. Actually, Mr. Thompson, she said, placing a folder in front of him, you signed a rather comprehensive prenuptial agreement in Las Vegas 7 years ago. You were quite intoxicated, but it's completely legal and binding. In the event of infidelity or abandonment, you receive only your personal premarital assets, plus anything acquired solely in your name during the marriage. Mark grabbed the folder, flipping through it frantically. I watched him recognize his signature, watched him remember that weekend in Vegas when he'd been so drunk on success and champagne that he'd signed anything I put in front of him, laughing about how we'd never need it because we were forever. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers. Emma tried to edge toward the door, but Patricia Howell's voice stopped her. Weren't you just saying you'd found an amazing investment opportunity? Something about a revolutionary app that would transform social commerce. Emma turned, trapped between the door and the accountability she'd spent her whole life avoiding. That's still in development, she said weakly. Because from what Connie just showed us, Margaret Walsh added, your last startup was shut down for misappropriation of funds. That's a rather serious accusation for someone seeking new investors. It was a misunderstanding, Emma said, but her voice had lost all its confidence, all its charm. An accounting error that got blown out of proportion. $3 million in accounting errors, I said quietly. including $50,000 in personal shopping charged as marketing expenses and $100,000 in travel that never had anything to do with the business. But hey, at least you learned to appreciate innovation, right? The devastation was complete. Mark sat staring at the prenup while Emma stood frozen by the door. The other guests were a mixture of shock schadenfreude and, in David Sterling's case, obvious admiration. Richard Howell cleared his throat, the sound drawing everyone's attention. "Mark," he said, his tone the one reserved for terminations, "we need to discuss your representation of your financial situation to the firm. You've claimed assets and net worth that appear to be significantly overstated. That's a serious issue for someone handling client portfolios. It wasn't technically illegal, but it was the kind of ethical gray area that firms like Goldman Sachs couldn't afford." Mark's career wouldn't end immediately, but he'd never make partner, never get the big accounts, never be more than a mid-level employee watching younger, hungrier people pass him by. I set down my wine glass, still untouched, and looked at the wreckage of my marriage scattered across my Thanksgiving table. "I have one more thing to share," I said. "The separation papers are in the study whenever you're ready to sign them, Mark. I've been generous. You have 30 days to relocate, and I'm not seeking any spousal support. Obviously." The laugh that escaped him was bitter and broken. Spousal support. From me. To you. The irony was too much for him to process. Emma finally found her voice, though it was thin and desperate. "Connie, we're sisters. You can't do this to me. I need help getting back on my feet. The apartment, the clothes. I have nothing." I looked at her, really looked at her, this golden child who'd been given everything and squandered it all. "You're right," I said. "You have nothing. But that's not my problem to solve anymore. You wanted Mark. You can have him. All $45,000 of him." The immediate aftermath was chaos wrapped in politeness. Richard Howell excused himself to make a phone call that would determine Mark's professional future. Patricia Howell helped herself to more wine and settled in to watch the drama unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd always suspected Mark was a fraud. Brad and Jennifer Stevens suddenly remembered they had to pick up their children from Jennifer's mother. Tom and Linda Chang made excuses about traffic and fled with the relief of people escaping a building fire. But my strategic guests remained. David Sterling poured himself scotch from Mark's prized bottle, the one being saved for special occasions, and raised it in my direction. Margaret Walsh was already on her phone texting her network about the spectacular implosion she was witnessing. James Patterson had his recorder out, though he kept it tactfully pointed away from the personal drama and toward the business revelation. Mark stood up from the table, his legs unsteady, his face cycling through emotions like a broken television. "This isn't over," he said, trying to summon authority he no longer possessed. "You can't just destroy my life like this." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply revealing what already existed. You destroyed your life the moment you decided I was less than you. I just provided the mirror." Emma hadn't moved from her position by the door, frozen like a deer, realizing the hunter had been there all along. "Connie, please," she said, tears starting to ruin her perfect makeup. "We're family. This was a mistake." Mark pursued me. I tried to resist. Mark's head snapped toward her. "What? You said you felt the same way. You said you'd been wanting this for years." It was fascinating watching them turn on each other, the alliance crumbling the moment it became a liability. Emma's survival instinct kicked in, the one that had always saved her from consequences. "He told me you were getting divorced," she said, throwing him under the bus with the efficiency of someone who'd had practice. "He said you'd grown apart, that you'd already discussed separation. I thought I was providing emotional support during a difficult time." "You lying witch," Mark snarled. "You came on to me. You said Connie didn't deserve me, that you could make me happier." They continued their circular firing squad while the remaining guests watched. David Sterling leaned over to me. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. 6 months, I replied. "Since he opened the separate bank accounts. I had alerts set up on our social security numbers. The moment he tried to hide assets, I knew." "But you kept quiet," Margaret Walsh said, joining our conversation. "You kept serving dinner and playing housewife while building your case." I looked at Mark and Emma, destroying each other's credibility with each accusation. I learned a long time ago that the best restructuring happens when people think you're not paying attention, I said. They show you exactly who they are when they think you're not important enough to notice. The next morning came gray and quiet. Mark had spent the night in a hotel taking only a suitcase and his wounded pride. Emma had called an Uber and disappeared into the night, her phone already lighting up with messages, as news of her latest failure spread through what remained of her network. I sat in my kitchen without question now drinking coffee and reviewing emails. 3 new clients had already reached out, having heard about the dinner through the efficient gossip network of the ultra-wealthy. David Sterling had sent a formal proposal for a partnership that would double my revenue. Margaret Walsh wanted to accelerate our venture fund timeline. My phone rang. Rebecca Martinez, my attorney. He signed, she said, without preamble. Came to my office at 7 a.m., looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Signed everything no contest. He just wanted it over. And Emma, I asked, though I already knew the answer. On a flight back to California. Apparently she's going to stay with college friends while she figures out her next move. Your parents called me, by the way. They wanted to know if you'd reconsider helping her. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. No, I said. Emma's had every advantage, every opportunity, every second chance. It's time she learned that consequences exist even for golden children. A month later, I was sitting in my office, the one that used to be Mark's man cave, reviewing the Forbes article James Patterson had written. The headline read, Shadow Empress, How Connie Thompson Built a $47 million Empire While Her Husband Thought She Was a Housewife. The piece was brilliant, focusing on the business rather than the personal drama, though the personal drama gave it the hook that would make it go viral. Mark had moved to a studio apartment in Jersey, commuting 2 hours each way to a job at a small firm that paid 1/3 of his previous salary. Goldman Sachs had quietly suggested he explore other opportunities after the extent of his misrepresentations became clear. He'd sent one email asking for reconciliation, which I'd archived without responding. Emma's situation was worse. The Forbes article had mentioned her embezzlement investigation, which prompted other investors to come forward with their own stories of Emma's creative accounting. She was facing 3 lawsuits and possible criminal charges. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a dental office in Fresno. Her social media accounts deleted her transformation from golden child to cautionary tale complete. But the most interesting development came 3 months later. David Sterling invited me to dinner not as a client, but as something else. I considered it carefully, the way I considered all opportunities. David was brilliant, ethical, and most importantly, he'd never once suggested I was less capable than I appeared to be. I understand you're not looking for a relationship, he said over excellent sushi. Neither am I. But I am interested in spending time with someone who understands that power isn't about showing it, but knowing when to reveal it. We didn't date in the traditional sense. We merged like companies with complementary assets. He never asked me to dim my light, never felt threatened by my success, never suggested I should be satisfied with less. When he proposed a year later, it was with a business plan instead of a ring showing how our combined resources could create an empire worth $200 million. I said yes, but kept my name. Phoenix Holdings remained mine alone, the empire built from ashes that no one could claim but me. 6 months after that, at another Thanksgiving dinner in the same dining room where my first marriage had ended, I stood to make a toast. The table was full again, but with different faces. Successful women I'd mentored, entrepreneurs who'd become friends, couples who understood that partnership meant amplification, not diminishment. This time last year, I learned something valuable about gratitude. I learned that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing their true colors. Mark and Emma thought they were taking something from me. In reality, they gave me the push I needed to stop hiding. I raised my glass this time, actually drinking from it. So here's to the people who underestimate us, who think our kindness is weakness, our silence is ignorance, our patience is acceptance. They teach us that the best revenge isn't destroying them, it's revealing ourselves. The room erupted in applause and laughter, the kind that comes from recognition from shared experience. Every woman at that table had her own story of being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. And every one of them had built something extraordinary in response. Later that evening, after the guests had gone, and David was helping clear dishes with the easy partnership of someone who didn't think domestic work was beneath him, I stood in the same spot where I'd overheard Mark and Emma planning their future without me. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if their deception had been a physical weight pressing down on every room. My phone buzzed with a notification. Another client request, another company needing the kind of surgical restructuring that had become my signature. The fee they were offering was more than Mark would make in 5 years at his new job. I smiled not from spite but from satisfaction. This was what building something real looked like. Looking back now from the vantage point of success that no longer needs to be hidden, I can trace the patterns that led to that explosive Thanksgiving revelation. The seeds were planted in childhood in a family where Emma's failures were reframed as adventures, while my successes were minimized as luck. Where her beauty was celebrated, while my intelligence was seen as intimidating. Where being chosen by someone like Mark was considered my greatest achievement. I spent so many years making myself smaller, easier to digest, less threatening to male egos and sister envy. I learned to hide my intelligence behind helpful suggestions, to frame my achievements as happy accidents, to let others take credit for my ideas, because it was safer than standing in my own light. Mark didn't create this pattern, he just benefited from it. Emma didn't start this dynamic, she just exploited it. The real tragedy wasn't that they betrayed me. It was that I had betrayed myself for so long, accepting their version of who I was supposed to be. The devoted wife, who was lucky to have landed a successful husband. The plain sister who should be grateful for any attention. The woman whose place was in the background, supporting, serving, smiling. But here's what I learned in therapy in the months after the dramatic revelation that made me briefly infamous in certain circles. We teach people how to treat us. Every time I dimmed my light to make Mark feel brighter, I taught him that his comfort was more important than my truth. Every time I let Emma's narratives go unchallenged, I taught her that her version of reality was the only one that mattered. The healing wasn't just about recovering from their betrayal. It was about forgiving myself for the years of self-betrayal. For all the times I knew my worth but chose to hide it. For all the moments I could have stood up but chose to sit down. For all the opportunities I let pass, because taking them would have meant threatening the delicate balance of ego and insecurity that kept my marriage stable. I think about the women I mentor now. Brilliant minds who come to me with business plans. They present as rough drafts when they're actually masterpieces. Women who apologize before speaking truths that could reshape industries. Women who have been taught, as I was taught, that their success is acceptable only if it doesn't overshadow the men around them. To them I tell this story. Not the Forbes version that focuses on the money or the viral social media version that focuses on the revenge. I tell them the real story. About the cost of hiding your light and the price of keeping secrets that aren't really secrets but surrenders. About the difference between keeping peace and keeping yourself small. The $12 million, the $47 million net worth, those numbers matter only because they're measurable proof of what was always there. The capability, the intelligence, the drive that I'd spent years disguising as luck and intuition and helpful suggestions. Money isn't the revenge or the reward. It's simply the receipt for value that was always being created, just not always acknowledged. Mark sent one final email 6 months ago on what would have been our 13th anniversary. He'd been through therapy too, he said. He understood now what he'd lost, not the money or the lifestyle, but the partnership he'd never recognized he had. He wanted me to know that he saw me now, really saw me, and he was sorry for all the years he'd looked right through me. I didn't respond, not out of anger or spite, but because his understanding came too late to matter. You can't unsee someone once you've finally seen them, but you also can't undo the damage of willful blindness. Some revelations are endings, not beginnings. Emma never reached out directly. But I heard through family that she'd started over again this time, without the family money or connections that had always cushioned her failures. She was working for the first time in her life. Maybe she'd build something real this time, something that wasn't borrowed or stolen or extracted from someone else's effort. Or maybe she'd just find new ways to repackage old failures. That was her journey to make. As for me, I no longer hide. I walk into rooms and own my success without apology or explanation. I negotiate deals without softening my expertise to protect fragile egos. I build empires in broad daylight instead of in shadows. I love without shrinking and partner without disappearing. That Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I lost a husband and a sister, but found something infinitely more valuable. Myself unleashed and unapologetic. The woman who'd always been there, building in the background, creating value in silence, generating wealth in shadows. She stepped into the light that day, not for revenge, but for revelation. Not to destroy, but to reveal what destruction had already occurred when two people decided I was worth less than I was. The lesson, if there is one beyond the obvious markers of betrayal and consequence, is this: your worth exists whether others recognize it or not. Your value doesn't diminish because someone fails to see it. Your light doesn't dim just because someone else needs darkness to feel bright. The empire you build in shadows is still an empire. The only question is whether you'll keep it hidden to maintain someone else's comfort or reveal it and risk their discomfort. That Thanksgiving, I chose revelation over comfort, truth over harmony, myself over their version of me. The 12 million wasn't the victory. The victory was finally admitting it was mine. The 47 million net worth wasn't the achievement. The achievement was acknowledging I'd earned every penny of it. Some people will read this story and focus on the money, the revenge, the dramatic dinner party revelation. But the real story is quieter and more revolutionary. It's about a woman who stopped pretending to be less than she was, who stopped apologizing for her competence, who stopped hiding her success to protect others from their own inadequacy. That's the gift Mark and Emma gave me without meaning to. By showing me who they really were, they forced me to show who I really was. By believing I was nothing, they pushed me to prove I was everything. By trying to leave me with nothing, they revealed I'd had everything all along. So thank you for watching my story unfold. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or undervalued, remember that your worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to see it. Your empire exists whether they acknowledge it or not. The only question is when you'll stop hiding it. What about you? Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only to later reveal your true capabilities? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please share this video with anyone who needs to hear that their worth isn't dependent on someone else's recognition. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to hear more stories of women who stopped hiding their light. Thank you for being here, for witnessing this truth. And remember, your empire is real, whether they see it or not. Build it anyway.